614 Productions presents the Not So Neutral Zone, a podcast for armchair enthusiasts by armchair enthusiasts. The opinions expressed on the show are those of their participants and in no way represent those of any sports leagues, organizations, or athletes therein. I'm your host, David Longest Yards Trexler, and my co-host, Jacob Waterboy Smith.
I'm doing it.
Gonna have to keep doing this every week because this is getting fun trying to come up with what we're gonna call each other.
You're gonna have to keep it a secret though. We want to make sure we do it first live on the show.
Especially if we have a guest on the show. We're definitely gonna have to initiate them right with something like David Batman Trexler, Jacob Robin Smith, and Aquaman. Just something they're gonna... I don't know if I want to come back. But today, we scrapped one of our plans. We'll wait till next week for that. This week we wanted to do top NFL players by position, 4 at the max. The other thing, if we've got time, is best players by team retired. But any of our list, unless we say active, they're going to be retired guys.
Yeah, don't want to do any, really get into the active players just because they still have more career left. And obviously this is inspired from the segment last week about the Mount Rushmores. A little bit more focus this week, just football, just players.
Okay, first up, one of the harder positions to kind of pick somebody for is punter.
Yeah, starting with the special teams.
I chose Reggie Roby. Not really Super Bowl caliber guy, but one of those guys when you think punter usually comes up. The other one, because I only come up with 2 just right out of my head. The other one was Todd Sauerbrunn. One of those guys who should have played linebacker, but he was a punter.
Yeah, I remember in his stint with Carolina where he just was like, he wanted to get in. On punt coverages, you didn't have 10 guys running at you. You had 11, and he wanted to lay you out.
My dad liked him because he would go out there and he would hit you hard enough that he'd knock you like 10 yards out of bounds off one hit, and you're going, that's a punter. What the heck is he doing?
Yeah, obviously, I went with a little bit of a safe pick. I went with Ray Guy, the Hall of Fame punter. Obviously, his attitude toward that has rubbed some people the wrong way, but he's still a great punter. Really, he filled out the Hall of Fame team. So, I mean, it's a complete team now.
Now, next we go to kicker. One of the guys I chose was Gary Anderson for having the most accurate at 99.2% point after touchdown kicks. Jason Elam, John Casey, Morton Anderson, and a surprise 5th guy that's probably your favorite, Ray Finkel.
Laces out.
Probably the most famous fictional football player ever, just because everybody, when they see a kicker miss, the laces were in. The laces were in.
I don't even know, sorry, rabbit trail here, but I don't even know many other fictional football players that rise to his level of significance. Who else can you really think of off the top of your head, fictional?
Probably either the kicker from The Waterboy or the kicker from The Replacements. Oddly enough, both guys connected to Adam Sandler because the guy from The Replacements played Adam Sandler's brother Adrian in Little Nicky. A little sideways there, but...
sideways. Obviously, Morton Anderson's my pick. All-time NFL scoring leader. Obviously, this season, Adam Vinatieri can pass his record, but he's still the leader as we sit right now and is still a legend. A honorable mention I would like to throw out there is George Blanda. He played quarterback, but then he played kicker for years after doing that. Granted, old school NFL, but still, he was around forever. I think he still has the longest career of any NFL player ever. 26 years, I think.
Okay, next up, the return man. Obviously, this was not a big position anybody talked about until Deion Sanders come around. But I put one of the top two guys I chose. Well, really, all four guys should be in the Hall of Fame. One of them, I can't remember his first name, but his last name is Mitchell. Most kick return yards, all-time leader. Punt return, same thing. The other guys, Desmond Howard, the only special teams player to ever win a MVP in a Super Bowl. Also, first guy to, I think, make the longest return in Super Bowl. The original return man, Steve Tasker. And then the last guy on the list is obviously a future Hall of Famer and the all-time leader in punt returns, kick returns for touchdowns, Devin Hester.
Now, I picked Devin Hester as well on mine, but I have to disagree with you on one point. I do not think he makes the Hall of Fame. I just don't think he does. I don't think there's a backlog at several positions in front, and it's just not a priority for the Hall. There's already people in the Hall that had good kick return backgrounds. Obviously, none as good as Devin Hester, but the Hall's going to pass him on that.
The main argument everybody has there is Steve Tasker should go in before Hester. I think both of them deserve it because Tasker was one of the first breakout return guys. Hester forced the NFL to change the rules because he was running them back. First any player to ever return a touchdown or a kickoff for a touchdown on the opening drive of a Super Bowl ever. So those guys, but the return game has never been, it's like offensive line. You're not really respected, but they know you help win the game. Next is a little bit easier than the last few. Defensive line. Your nose tackle, defensive line, or defensive tackle, defensive end. I went with Mean Joe Green, Michael Strahan, Bruce Smith of the Bills, and Reggie White.
Yeah, Reggie White is probably one of the top ones. You've got Strahan. Yes, he broke that sack record in a season with some controversy. For those of you that don't know, it is alleged that Brett Favre basically laid down for him to get the sack record. That is denied by both parties, but it's pretty obvious if you watch the tape. But yeah, with Bruce Smith, Jason Taylor, you got some nasty pass rushers out there. Little side note on this. Who do you think some of the best run stoppers have been? You got New England for all those years. Oh, what is his name? I forgot. Big guy.
Seymour? Richard Seymour? I think that's his name.
The recent guy.
Vince Wilfork.
Yes, Wilfork. How could I forget his name? Anyway.
Also returned a fumble, I think it was, for a touchdown. Imagine, how can you not tackle this big guy? He's just sitting there running down the field and almost scored a touchdown.
I always thought that they should bring back these big guys running the ball. I mean, think about it. If it's 4th and 6 inches, hand it to some guy that's 350 pounds and is just going to bowl into that line.
Like the Fridge for the Bears or B.J. Raji with the Packers was another one.
What they call themselves, the Fridge and the Freezer?
Also, another guy Bill Belichick used, current Tennessee Titans head coach Mike Vrabel, was used as fullback quite a bit. Okay, next, one that you said you had a tough time with, offensive line.
Oh, that's a fun one.
I've got Randall McDaniel from the Vikings, Dan Dierdorf of the Cardinals, ex-Monday Night Football guy, Orlando Pace of the Saints, and Jackie Slater, one of the longest careers for a lineman from the Rams.
All right. Well, I'll answer that. I have some friends that are big Cincinnati fans, and we had an argument one night, or more of a discussion. It wasn't really an argument of the best Cincinnati player of all time, and we came to the agreement that it was probably Anthony Nunez. Doesn't get a whole lot of respect because he played on Cincinnati, but I think he's one of the top ones. Another name that you didn't mention, Jeff Saturday. I know that he gets wrapped up with those Colts teams, but Jeff Saturday was still really good. And then another big one I'd like to mention is Walter Jones, the longtime tackle in Seattle. I think the neat story with him is 11 seasons played, 10 holding calls, if I'm remembering that right.
Not easy to keep from getting those calls.
No.
Now, because I'm more of a defensive guy. I don't know about you, but I like to watch plays thinking I'm like a defensive coordinator.
Mm-hmm.
So next is probably one of my favorite positions, linebacker. Okay, I went with Mr. San Diego Charger, or Mr. Charger, whichever one you call him, Junior Seau, Mr. Baltimore Raven, Ray Lewis, Lawrence Taylor, obviously got to put him on a linebacker list, and the next, one of the greatest linebackers to ever play for the Chicago Bears, Dick Butkus.
Dick Butkus. And Chicago has such a rich tradition of linebackers. It's unreal.
They had
Singletary,
Rivera, Urlacher, Briggs, Butkus. You could probably sit there and just come up with a top 5 or top 10 greatest players ever, and just pick everybody from the Bears Super Bowl winning team.
It was such a great team. They just destroyed everybody.
It's almost like the Cowboys teams of the 90s. You knew every player on the roster, and it was like there was no ego on the team. It wasn't, I need the ball, or I need the ball for 30 yards to get my bonus, or I need 6 interceptions. I'm one way to get my bonus. It was just a good cast there.
And with linebackers, sometimes you got to make the distinction between the more pass rushing linebackers and the more drop back linebackers, where you've got like Urlacher that played like say Kuechly plays now, not a pass rusher. Captain of the defense, hold the middle of the field. Then where you have like Lawrence Taylor, that's more of a Von Miller type, rushing the passer.
More, not necessarily Von Miller.
Not necessarily, yes.
More Perfect or James Harrison. And, these guys now, the way they get penalized for stuff, Lawrence Taylor was the guy that would hit you, knock you out, see your eyeball hanging out, and stand there and go, "What? You deserve it. Get up, I'll knock the other one out," and then walk off. Never, "Oh, I'm sorry."
He's one of those guys that was just insanely talented. Perhaps lacked motivation, but was just so talented you couldn't pass him up.
With him, I'd love to know how much of his character, the Shark, in Any Given Sunday was real Lawrence Taylor or scripted. Because in the movie, the character was like, That's LT. That's the real guy. And it was just crazy watching him play. Next was one of my favorite positions to pick, because I didn't even have to think for any of these 4 guys. I got another Baltimore Raven from that Super Bowl team when they beat the Giants the first time around. Ed Reed. I got Ronnie Lott, Mr. Oakland Raider and 49er, great defensive guy. Rod Woodson, played almost everywhere on the defense. Linebacker, cornerback, safety, kick returner, punt returner. He could win on all these lists. Now with, I believe it's the Raiders as a defensive coach. And then, speaking of the 49ers, the third guy on this team connected to the 49ers for me, John Lynch. The guy who was so crazy that he played in a game against his brother-in-law. His brother-in-law went to catch a pass. He blindside hits this dude, knocks him out, gets a concussion. Imagine how interesting Thanksgiving was. John Lynch looking at his brother-in-law and going, "Hey, so how's your season been? I don't remember nothing after you hit me."
I believe I read a story on that once where where his brother-in-law does not remember any of that game, which I probably wouldn't either.
All you see is a 47 coming at you, and pow, you're out.
Honorable mentions. Let's see, who all did you have again?
John Lynch, Rod Woodson, Ronnie Lott, and Ed Reed.
Some honorable mentions. You got Charles Woodson, Rondé Barber, Brian Dawkins. Did you mention him?
Brian Dawkins? I did not. But I do have Charles Woodson on my cornerback list, too.
Yeah, he did both. Is that the next one?
Yes, it is. And
all right, well, might as well jump right onto that.
On that list, Rod Woodson's on that list as well because he was just one of my favorite defensive guys before Deion got in the game. Deion Sanders also on that list. Charles Woodson, the guy who beat Peyton Manning for the Heisman Trophy, also retired the same year as Peyton. So it was kind of cool for them guys to come into the league and leave the league at the same time. And then you got Larry Brown, Super Bowl MVP for the Cowboys.
Yeah. Some of the other names, you got, let's see, Champ Bailey.
Champ Bailey was on there. Darryl Green. There was just so many guys that one that was hard to pick.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of crossover between corner and safety, so sometimes it's hard to pick. And then, obviously, a lot of corners transition to safety later in their careers.
Next up, we're heading to the other side of the ball. In the same respect that probably Rob Gronkowski, when he hangs it up, him, maybe Jimmy Graham, and maybe Greg Olsen, these guys might join this tight end list, but I've got Shannon Sharp, Tony Gonzalez, a guy you said you weren't familiar with, but Jay Novacek of the 90s Cowboys Super Bowl team. And lastly, the only guy in Chicago for the Chicago Bears that can say he took the Bears to the Super Bowl as a player and coach, Mike Ditka.
Ditka!
By the way, loved him and kicking and screaming.
Yeah, he was really good in that. You covered it pretty well with tight ends. There's not a whole lot. There's a lot of good names if you really dig deep, but tight end's a little difficult because prior to the passing era, tight ends were really kind of just blocking.
You did have Kellen Winslow Sr. and Jr. could be on that list.
Ozzie Newsome.
Ozzie was number 5 on my list. He almost made it, but I felt Mike Ditka deserved a spot because of that unique stat of being one of those player coaches to do both. Plus, like we were talking before we started recording, the Bears team, or even earlier when we were talking, the Bears organization is kind of like the Packers. They're so storied that you could almost do a fantasy draft of both teams all time, and like with Devin Hester, Dick Butkus, Mike Ditka. I think that's the only Bears I did put. Well, I've got one more. You'll probably agree with me on him, but they had so many good players that turned into good coaches. Singletary, Fisher, Rivera, Ditka. It's just hard to argue against them. I mean, even Harbaugh. Okay. Next, we've got the running back and fullback position. I almost made this separate because there's so many good fullbacks out there. Zonka. I can't think of all the other guys. Allstott that transitioned to running back. Daryl Moose Johnston. So right there's 3 of the 4. But my running backs were obviously 2 of the greatest all time to play at the same time. Emmitt Smith, Barry Sanders, Mr. Chicago, Walter Payton, and I put the last guy on the list because he's known for one of the greatest catches in history, the immaculate reception, Franco Harris.
Some more modern, if you want to say, unfortunately with running backs, they've kind of fallen out of use. I don't want to say fallen out of use. It's more by committee now. It's like, okay, well, it's first and 10, bring in your power runner. It's third down, bring in the scrappy guy that can catch passes out of the backfield. You don't have sort of the lead back anymore. So when you do have a lead back in the modern era, it has to be someone really good. LaDainian Tomlinson scored all those touchdowns for San Diego.
The modern day LT.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that got really confusing. They wanted to call him LT as well. LDT is another abbreviation I've seen for him.
Other guys I considered were Marshall Faulk, Curtis Martin, Jerome Bettis.
The bus.
Because they were guys that were good. Another one that would have made my fullback list was Tom Rathman, longtime 49ers coach and Raiders coach, was another good one. But I felt those 4 were better.
What active running backs do you think get in this conversation? Frank Gore, but who else?
If his career continues like it did last year and he doesn't fall off any, McCaffrey could make that list. Adrian Peterson, that suspension kind of hurt him a little, but I still think he could get on that list.
Definitely just from a on-the-field performance perspective, Peterson's in too.
And I can't think of the guy for Atlanta that they've got now, running back. He could be on that list if he improved. And really, anybody that goes into the Patriots organization while Belichick's coach, it's hard not to. LeGarrette Blount would be a good one. Went to the Super Bowl with the Patriots, turned around next season, won the Super Bowl with the Eagles.
See, some more active, younger guys. You got Le'Veon Bell. You've got Ezekiel Elliott that his career continue to grow. I think him and Dak make a good 1-2 attack.
I'm trying to think of the other guy. DeMarco Murray and LaShawn McCoy kind of fell off, so I don't see them making this list.
Yeah, they'll be Hall of Very Good, not Hall of Great.
Next up, my favorite offensive position. I saved my least favorite offensive position for last because without guys like Jackie Slater, Orlando Pace, Dan Dierdorf, Randall McDaniel, Shannon Sharp, Tony Gonzalez, Jay Novacek, Mike Ditka, Harris Payton, Sanders Smith, and these wide receivers, the quarterbacks would be nothing because those guys have to make the catches, take the handoff, block, run for touchdowns, and save the quarterback's butt. So, obviously, first guy on the list, Super Bowl MVP, Jerry Rice.
The GOAT.
Of that
the
position.
original.
Yes.
The original GOAT.
The next, one of the great, next to Jerry Rice, he was probably the greatest wide receiver of the 90s, Michael Irvin. Next guy, we mentioned his brother as one of the greatest tight ends. Sterling Sharp of the Packers, key to Brett Favre having that great career. And then, got to make another Waterboy reference here. Lynn Swann. Got to put Swanee on the list. One of the guys I considered putting on this list was, you probably got him on yours. Let's see.
You talking divas?
Well, wide receivers, they could be great.
Wide receivers, they could be great. There's a couple different names. You obviously didn't mention Randy Moss, which we talked about, I think, last week, where that if you could find someone with Rice's work ethic and Randy Moss's talent, they would be unstoppable. Randy Moss, he's absolutely hilarious on, what is that, Monday Night Countdown?
Just the country in his voice. He sounds more country than I do right now. Yeah, I'm telling you, man, he is really good. I like watching this guy. And it's like, Randy, where are you from?
And then you've got two people with at least on the field personalities in opposite corners. You got Marvin Harrison, who was never really the big diva, really kind of quiet. There's allegations of off the field stuff, which we won't get into. And then you have Terrell Owens, who's all the way over here from Marvin Harrison personality wise. How many teams did Owens end up playing for because of his personality issues?
He played for the 49ers, the Eagles, the Cowboys, the Bills. I think 4.
He played for 5 because he was on Cincinnati for a season.
That's
too.
right. Batman and Robin. Chad Johnson, Marvin Harrison, Reggie Wayne. I think Peyton Manning would not be as great as he's put out to be if it weren't for, 1, his defenses, 2, guys like Reggie and Marvin building up his stock.
You make the counter argument that Peyton made them great. And as far as Indianapolis's defenses, they weren't exactly that great when he was there. I think if he had more steady defense, he probably would have won another Super Bowl there. And you see the same issue with the Andrew Luck Colts. The general management just can't seem to put a defense together to complement that offense. So I disagree with you on that point.
Now to quarterbacks.
Yep.
All 4 guys on my list have Super Bowl trophies. 3 of the 4 were MVPs for their team. First, I'm going to start with the only guy on the list without the MVP trophy. Brett Favre. Because Brett Favre was one of those guys that defined and longevity at quarterback where it was lacking. Then you've got Troy Aikman. Super Bowl rings with Dallas. Not to mention, not other than his co-host for football games, Troy actually knows what he's talking about versus the other guy. The other 2 guys would probably be the ones to be the counter argument to Tom Brady's and Peyton Manning's being the greatest quarterbacks of all time. Terry Bradshaw, who has played in a lot of Super Bowls, and it's funny to watch on Fox NFL Sunday. Just listen to him talk. And then the guy who has returned to the conversation of greatest quarterback to win a Super Bowl because he is the only one on this list undefeated in Super Bowls, and only quarterback to ever win a Super Bowl without having ever lost one is Joe Montana.
Sorry. Okay. As far as quarterbacks go, I'm not sure exactly what you have against Peyton Manning, but I think he belongs on that list too. Yes, passing era. Yeah, the league's different. But he set and broke a lot of records. Football is a team sport. but I think Peyton Manning's probably the top that is retired. If you want to start counting actives, things start to get funny. Brett Favre, the original gunslinger. Go back a little old school. You got a lot of people that in the older NFL that made waves. You got Fran Tarkenton, Warren Moon,
Broadway Joe.
Broadway Joe. Joe Namath, he was really only good for like 1 or 2 seasons, but he was such a personality, and of course New York media market, that he's kind of had a long. People remember him better than maybe some of the guys better than him.
I think on the quarterback side of things, Peyton didn't make my list, not because of any issues, but the 4 guys I chose actually barely made the list as far as like Bradshaw and Favre, because I almost went Bart Starr, or not even looking at Favre for the list. But it was just like Jim Kelly almost made my list, because how many guys can say they would quarterback the team that went to 4 consecutive Super Bowls? So it was kind of like Peyton Manning was, okay, if I find anybody I don't want to list, he's going to be one of the 4.
Yeah, the quarterback list is just so rich. You have a rich history of quarterbacks going pre-Super Bowl.
Now, the other topic I wanted to cover has a lot of quarterbacks on. Was you suggested it after we finished up last week, was best or our favorite player by team that's retired. And I've got a lot of quarterbacks on this list, and unfortunately, one team, the 49ers, I could not choose between the two. And I think we'll do that by division and conference first. We'll do the West, NFC West.
All right. What team you want to open up with?
One of the harder ones for both of us, Arizona. I went with Dan Dierdorf. Now, Larry Fitzgerald, once he has officially signed all the paperwork to say, I'm done, I think he'll take that spot off my list.
Yeah, Fitzgerald will be on the top of that list. I had to do some deep digging on this because, at least in my lifetime, Arizona was good for like 2 seasons. They made the playoffs several years, but that Super Bowl run was about the biggest memory I even have of them.
They also hold the North American sports record for the longest playoff drought at 70 years. If they don't win it this year, it's 71. They haven't won since 1947. Being one of the oldest football teams in sports, like I think 1894 or 1897. So it's been a long time for those guys.
So the guy I came up with in research is a quarterback from he played there from 66 to 83. Jim Hart. He ended up, this is prior to the move to Arizona. This is when they're in St. Louis. So I guess he could be called a St. Louis great. Anyway, he led the Cardinals to 3 playoff appearances, 3 playoff games. They only have in the Super Bowl era, they only have 5 or 6 playoff games, and 3 came in one year, their Super Bowl run year. But this guy led them to 3 playoff appearances, 74, 75, and 82, and they lost all 3. So
another guy I don't think either one of us thought of would fit with that team, with Arizona, or the next team we talk about, Kurt Warner. But I believe if you polled Cardinals fans, their choice would be Pat Tillman. He may not have had an impact in his career, but it was his post-career, and the way he died was his memorable thing. I'm going to just run down my list for all 4 teams, kind of move it along a little. But for the Rams, Jackie Slater, for that career he had. Seattle, Steve Largent, the guy who Jerry Rice asked his permission to wear his number in Seattle. And then for San Francisco, I'm going to make the call right now while we're talking and cross Montana off and say Jerry Rice.
You say Jerry Rice? I think you have to go with Rice on that because he's simply undisputed at his position.
That and he helped make Montana great and helped Steve Young be the great successor.
All right. For mine, for the Rams, Isaac Bruce.
I like him. I like Isaac.
Bruce.
I can go with that one.
Yeah. Big part of the greatest show on turf. Let's see. For Seahawks, Walter Jones, who I just mentioned in the player by position. And then, of course, for the 49ers, Jerry Rice.
Now, let's go to our division, the NFC South. I went with, for Tampa Bay, it was very hard because of that Super Bowl roster they had, but I went with John Lynch. For the Saints, a hard one to choose, I went with tackle Willie Roaf, just one of my favorite all-time Saints. Another guy I liked for the Saints, I put for the Panthers, is probably the guy that every Panthers player, coach, and fan would probably agree, Sam Mills. And for the Falcons, with as many guys as they've had, like Dion and Hester and some of the other guys, I went with Jesse Tuggle. So I kind of went a little old school there.
All right. Well, I'll save my team for last. Let's go through some of the other ones. For the Falcons, that's such a tough one. Probably going to have to go with Roddy White.
I'll go with Roddy. I like Roddy.
Like Roddy?
Even though he wasn't originally the number one receiver there initially, he stepped up in the void and became the guy.
Probably an honorable mention on that might be Michael Vick. You know, I didn't really like him because division rival and all that. But the way he played was so different. Plus, of course, you get him in Madden, and you were pretty much unstoppable.
I actually used him on Madden in a season, injured, just to get one of the achievements of using an injured player. It ran for like a 60-yard touchdown with an injured leg.
Tampa.
Warren Sapp?
Yeah, Warren Sapp. And a lot of that, he's done a lot of good in his post career too. He does a lot of rebuilding projects. What a Houston player was received? Who was that? Was it Watson? I think it's Deshaun Watson. As a child, his family received a home.
Yeah, from Warren. Yeah, it was him.
From Sapp. So, you know, it helps. It pays dividends in the future for his off-the-field activities.
What about the Saints? How hard was that one for you?
That is a tough one.
Because I think we both agreed Drew Brees would be the guy if he were retired.
I mean, I think you've got to go, like, way down the list. I know he played with several other teams, but someone we mentioned in the previous segment, Morton Anderson, played about half of his career there. So I think I'd go with him. The Saints just, their history is very modern. You know, the Super Bowl win after Katrina and all that. A lot of people forget that for years before that, they were kind of just a mediocre team.
Okay.
And then the Carolina Panthers. This one is probably the toughest for me because there's so many names. There's big names. Then you've got role players that were there for years. But I'm going to go with the safe pick here and say Steve Smith. He really, you know, short wide receiver, coming with a chip on his shoulder. Attitude issues, yes. But I think he's one of my favorite Panthers of all time.
I think what he and one of my top 5 least favorite Panthers, Jordan Gross. What those two did to Cam Newton that last year and a half, 2 years they were there, to get him to pull his head out of his you-know-what and get out there and be a team player worked. Because once they left, he stepped up. So, yeah, I think Steve Smith would be a close second, but I picked Sam because the Panthers' whole motto since Sam played was keep pounding. And it's just been like a motto for the Panthers. You see keep pounding on a lot of stuff.
Have some keep pounding merchandise.
Now, we're going to the NFC North with two of the oldest teams and the oldest rivalry in football. None of my players that I picked for this division have played in the last 10 years.
Oh, wow.
I'm going for the Minnesota Vikings. One of the guys who led the way as a running quarterback, Warren Moon. Randy Moss was my second pick for that team. Green Bay, hands down, Reggie White. Detroit, Mr. Lion himself, Barry Sanders. And Chicago, sweetness, Walter Payton.
Yeah, with Chicago's, I have to agree with you. Walter Payton, sweetness is he's the greatest player they ever had. For Green Bay, you've got so many good players to pick from. But gonna have to go with a little bit of recency bias and have to pick Brett Favre. For the Vikings, that's a tough one because they've got a rich history as well. But I'm going to go with Fran Tarkenton, one of the honorable mentions that I had. I think he was pretty good on the ground too. Not quite as good as Warren Moon, but he had some, his career rushing touchdowns. He had 32 career rushing touchdowns, which is pretty good. And then for the Detroit Lions, it's got to be Barry Sanders. It's amazing with some of these teams, especially the age on a lot of the teams in the NFC North, how easy it can be to pick.
Megatron would have probably been another one, or Billy Sims, who wore the number 20 for Detroit before Barry, because it seemed like after Barry retired, that team dropped off, and then the Lions did to Megatron what they did to Barry Sanders, forced him into retirement before it was too soon. And I know we're still going through the teams, but I just realized one of the greatest safeties we've left off our list.
Oh, who did we leave?
Palomalu.
Oh.
Another guy who changed the game in his time.
See, those Steelers teams that he was on had so many different memorable names that he gets lost in it sometimes. But yeah, I just remember him, like, they were playing Tennessee, I think, and he went over the line and tackled the quarterback within like 2 seconds.
I remember watching one game. He was back in the safety position almost 20 yards from the scrimmage line. Ran up to the line, and I think that's the one you're talking about. He shot through the line, hit the quarterback, and I was going, where'd he come from?
I don't remember the exact play. Maybe we'll have to look it up and put it in the show notes. But the funny thing about that play is it was not scored a sack because they simply didn't know whether or not it was a running play. There was not enough time to even figure out if it was or not.
Did we get through your whole NFC North?
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to the NFC East, where the most recent player I've got is for the Cowboys. Everybody else played in the 80s and 90s at the latest. So I got Dallas, Emmitt Smith, Giants, of course, LT, Washington, John Riggins. And for the Eagles, the other guy along with Warren Moon, that made the running quarterback, Randall Cunningham.
All right. Yeah. For the Cowboys, that's an easy pick. I'm going to go Emmitt Smith on that one, just simply because of his career. For the Giants, somebody else we already talked about, Lawrence Taylor. For the Eagles, that's where things get a little funny because there's a lot of names up there. There's some more modern guys. I almost said McNabb. He was really good there for a stretch. But I had to go Brian Dawkins.
Brian was a close second, and I always remember him as his nickname, Big Daddy. Whether it was with the Eagles or the Broncos, he was the big name for him.
Then definitely the hardest to pick for out of the 4 teams in that division was the Redskins. And I went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth about who to pick. And at the end of the day, I ended up having to go with Joe Theismann. I had to go with him. But there's a lot of other good names on that list.
Another one would have been Doug Williams.
Doug Williams.
Another great player for him. Definitely another tough one. I mean, it's hard when you try to go by player and you try to narrow down thousands of names for some of these teams or hundreds of names in the case of like Houston. Now the next list, most recent, I think was in the 90s as well. I didn't pick. It was hard to pick anybody that's played in like the last 10 years, the last 12 years really, because it just seems like under the current leader, it has watered down a lot. Where some of the guys, like for my list, Denver, hard to go against. Peyton Manning could be a tough case to argue here, but with guys like Terrell Davis, Bill Romanowski playing for him, I went with John Elway for the Broncos, Ronnie Lott for the Raiders, for the Chargers, Junior Seau, and I went real old school for the Chiefs with Lynn Dawson.
It's old school. Yeah, I don't think there's a very good argument for Peyton. He had a really, really good, 2-3 seasons, especially the 2015 run. Anyway, where they ran into Seattle in the Super Bowl. That, okay. I forgot where my train of thought was going. But yeah. So, for Denver is John Elway.
Hard to go against that.
A lot of people forget, since he closed his career off with back-to-back Super Bowl wins, that he lost. How many did he lose before they won? 2?
2 or 3.
I think it might have been 3. So he was the guy that kept getting there and couldn't make it happen. And when he finally closed his career off with back-to-back wins, now he's a Hall of Famer. The Raiders are a tough one to pick. They've got a storied history, but they don't have a player that really stands head and shoulders above everybody else. So I dug deep, did some research, and the player I came out with was Jim Otto.
Otto, 00.
That's right. Played center for him for years. Just one of the old school Maulum linemen. Really, really one of their greatest players ever.
And I may be wrong, but I believe he's the one that forced the NFL to institute the rule of numbers by position, because a lot of teams saw 00 and they're, where's he play?
Which I really don't like that. That might be something to argue about in a later episode. The next one, the Chargers. Chargers are difficult. I have a little bit of recency bias on that one as well. Mine was up in the air between Seau and Tomlinson, and I got to go with Junior.
Another Waterboy reference. We may title this episode The Waterboy Argument because Dan Fouts last game of the year, can't hold anything back from Waterboy was another great one. Just played during a bad tenure.
And then, of course, the last one, the Chiefs. That one is so tough. They've got some active people, some on the defense with Eric Berry that may make this list one day. But I went a little bit more modern than you, and this is somebody we talked about in the previous segment with Tony Gonzalez. You being a little bit older than me, a little bit. Obviously, it makes sense you picking some of the older ones and me picking some of the new ones. I think that helps keeps this fresh, so we're not picking the same people all.
A little more dynamic than Than okay, we're gonna go with this guy. We actually, we could even do a future list on coaches. Because that's another difficult one.
Like some of the teams, like their greatest coach of all time, some of them would be really difficult. Some of them would be pretty easy. Some of the list would be very short, like Pittsburgh, Houston. Who do you think their greatest coach is?
Probably, I don't know, maybe the current one. He's had the most success. Of course, you'd have to argue Dom Capers started them, but yeah, with them it's difficult because they're so young. Were you done with your West?
Yeah, that was the last spot on the West.
Let's jump to the hardest one because of having two teams that are under 30 years old, so you have less talent to choose from. First one, I took into consideration who you talked about with Andre Johnson because I couldn't think of anybody else. I'm going to skip over Indy because I want to do them last. Jacksonville, I originally had Tony Baselli, who was one of their original tackles and played for Houston, so he could have been on both. I chose Maurice Jones-Drew. For Tennessee, I went Houston Oilers for the Tennessee Titans pick and went with my Minnesota pick, Warren Moon, the only guy to be on my list twice.
Mm.
Indianapolis, there is a quarterback that suited up for the Colts that is head and shoulders above Peyton Manning, Johnny Unitas, who also has his jersey retired by the Ravens despite never playing for them, but because of his contributions to the city of Baltimore as a Colt.
Yeah, and when the Colts moved, he really didn't move with them. He kind of disowned them at that point and
played for the Chargers.
Mm-hmm. So, this division is definitely the toughest with the two young teams, and then you have franchises. The other two franchises in there moved, and one of them changed their name, so it's even more difficult there. So you got Jacksonville. It's such a tough one, but I had to go with Fred Taylor. He was, you remember him now. That's a name sometimes people have to pull out and go, oh, hey, I remember him. Yeah, he's got over 10,000 yards rushing, but people still forget about him. But he was the guy there for a while. Then you've got Houston, and I'm gonna stick with what I said pre-show, and stick with Andre Johnson. Obviously, didn't end on good terms, but the thing is, when they separate on bad terms, that fades over time. Brett Favre has kind of been welcomed back to Green Bay
after the Minnesota stint.
I don't know if he had been welcomed back so easily if he had won Minnesota Super Bowl, but I guess we'll never get to know that. Andre Johnson, I don't know if Houston's got a Ring of Honor or something, but he needs to be in that. And then you've got the Tennessee Titans, previously the Houston Oilers, and just to pick someone a little bit more recent than you. I was going to say Moon, but I think I'm now going to go with Steve McNair, another quarterback.
The guy who almost got the organization its first Super Bowl.
1 yard short. That sucks. But yes, Steve McNair was a good quarterback in his own right. And then Indianapolis. I was torn between this one because Indianapolis, the Colts organization is really a tale of two cities. Because you got the Baltimore run and then you have the Indianapolis run. Now, I'm not sure, but I think this past year, maybe, they've now been in Indianapolis more years than they were in Baltimore. I may be remembering that wrong. But for them, for their Indianapolis run, it's got to be Peyton Manning. But you've got Harrison and Wayne and Saturday and a little bit of overlap. You got like Edgerrin James.
The Edge.
And then, of course, with the Baltimore days, it's Johnny U. So
now
we got one more division.
Two. We got the North and the East.
I forgot them.
With the North, Baltimore, their player, or for Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh, my choices never played in the NFL during the Baltimore Ravens' existence. But for Baltimore, obviously, Ray Lewis. For Cincinnati, I originally was going to go with Anthony Munoz, but I changed it at the last second to Boomer Esiason. For Cleveland, there is no other player that when you say Cleveland Browns, that anybody thinks of except Jim Brown. Just one of my all-time favorite Browns. And for Pittsburgh, Franco Harris. Another one of those tough teams to pick.
Yeah, Pittsburgh's got a storied history. Digging in and really looking at them, it just depends upon which way you want to go. Is the defense there what makes Pittsburgh Pittsburgh? Because if so, then obviously you throw out Terry Bradshaw.
Any of the Steel Curtain defense.
I think you could pick just about any of them. But I let my personal feelings decide this one a little bit. And I went with a really good wide receiver who also has a great catch in a Super Bowl with Hines Ward.
The pass from Antoine Randall,
Mm-hmm.
that pitch from Roethlisberger, Randall throws it. One of those great trick plays. Yeah, Hines. Also interesting is Hines Ward is the first Korean American MVP of a Super Bowl. So he has his own little unique club he's in without anybody else in.
Then the Ravens, this is another team that's history is short. You could argue that past Browns belong in this. I personally don't. I think of the Ravens as their own franchise. They have their own identity. But for them, you've got a couple options on defense. What was your pick for Baltimore?
Ray Lewis.
Ray Lewis? Well, I'll pick the other then. Ed Reed. Tom Brady, as a young quarterback, had written on his play sleeve on his arm to find Ed Reed. Every play. Find him. Know where he is. Because you need to know this.
During that tenure with Lewis and Reed on the team, was one of those teams I knew 3 of the 4 defensive backs. You had Samari Roll, number 22, Chris McAllister, 21, and Ed Reed, 20, in that secondary that you didn't know who to throw towards, who to throw away from, so you had to kind of manipulate that defense that way. You ready for the last one?
No, I didn't get through my list.
Okay.
I still have 2 more teams. All right, Cleveland. Again, the argument's been made that historical Cleveland players should belong to Baltimore. Not going to get into that. But Cleveland, prior to the move, has a lot of historical players. You pick the guy with Jim Brown. But they also had this this linebacker whose name sounds really familiar. Clay Matthews. They had him. He played there from 78 to 93. He was, the Matthews family is obviously famous in football.
His brother Bruce with the Oilers and the Titans.
Mm-hmm.
And now their sons are playing.
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of NFL history wrapped in him. And I actually did not know that he had played for Cleveland. I had to actually do some research on this, but he did. So, again, to go with our theme of older and newer, which wasn't even planned upon. And then for Cincinnati, again, someone else we touched on in the previous one with Anthony Muniz.
AFC East. Again, other than my New England pick, everybody's from like the 80s or 90s. I got, for the Jets, Namath. Patriots, Teddy Bruschi. Buffalo, I went with Thurman Thomas, running back. And for the Dolphins, arguably, probably the greatest quarterback in the history of football to never win a Super Bowl in Dan Marino.
All right, yeah. So the Patriots are a tough one. You've got a big list of them, but I got to go with the guy whose name I forgot earlier, in Vince Wilfork. Love the guy. Maybe not, if you want to look at it logically, he may not be their best player, but I just really liked him. And he was a player of class, and he could take 2-3 guys on at once, stuff the run, open up lanes for pass rushers. He's my favorite big guy ever. For the Jets, they just haven't been historically great. They've had good stretches, but I think you've got to go back to Joe Namath. I don't think there's anyone more modern that was better than him, or at least had more personality or media influence. And then for Buffalo, Jim Kelly. Got to be Jim Kelly. Although you could make an argument for OJ. OJ would probably be viewed in a lot brighter light and would probably be ranked over Jim Kelly, if not for his off-the-field stuff after he retired. And then you got Miami. You got to go Dan Marino.
Yeah, it's hard to think of anybody there. The only other player who kind of defined anything with that team was Pete Stoyanovich, a kicker. And only because I want to say he's the guy that had the odd kicking style of walking up, turning his back to the line, and standing, and he would kind of do a curve around and kick the ball.
Well, I think we just covered everybody. Was that every division?
Yeah, that was everybody. You wanna try to hit that other topic, or you wanna save it?
Well, what's our out time?
I'm not sure.
Well, I think we've recorded enough for today. After editing and everything, we might get it in under an hour.
Hopefully next week we can maybe swing a guest on.
Let's see. We'll see if we can land one. Oh, yeah, for a little tease of next week, the brackets for March Madness drop. We're recording this on Saturday, so tomorrow, which would be the 11th.
And I think the interesting thing to do is we're going to have to let everybody know that you have your bracket, I have mine, and we talked about doing one together to see, how does my bracket, your bracket, in this joint bracket which one's the better one? Are we better individual or together?
And I'm going to try to see if I can get someone who knows very little to nothing at all about March Madness and college basketball. See how well she does picking her bracket.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting once we get down the road towards the summer with the show, because then we'll have our fantasy league back, and how can, like the last few seasons, I started out my first year, changed the team name to the Dirty Birds after the Falcons. Then for the last 2 seasons, just to kind of mess with one of the other guys, I changed the team's name to the Crush FC, like a soccer sounding name. Although I'm thinking about changing it again this year to like AC Crush or SC Crush, something soccer related, just to kind of mess with him again.
Yeah. We've done 3 seasons in our fantasy football league. I was the opening year champion and lost in this prior year's championship game. So we've had 3 different champions. I'm going to try to keep that streak running. Not really. I'm going to try to win it again.
I just got to try to get back to the playoffs this year after missing in 2 of the 3 years I made the playoffs. Just for me, unfortunately, 2 years ago, Gronk went down with the injury and killed that season. But I'm thinking this year, I got to bring LeGarrette Blount back to the team because he was just so good at how quick I picked up on him. But I think we may do a show and have as many of the people from the league on here, so we kind of maybe even do a special recording the night of the draft and do like a semi-live draft, where we just sit here and talk and everybody says, okay, this is who I'm picking.
I think that would be really interesting. I would like to try to get all the owners on the show. Maybe not all at once. That would be a mess. But all the owners on the show at one point throughout the season, and maybe talk to everybody about what their strategy is and all that.
Next show, try to aim and see if we can get co-commissioner Jordan on here, because he'll be able to give us insight on basketball, baseball, the tournament, and his how he's going to pick or who he's going to pick.
All right, I think that about wraps up the show for today. Here in just a few seconds, David, you wanna send us off?
Get us out of here. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Not So Neutral Zone. Check us out on our Facebook page, the Not So Neutral Zone, our YouTube channel, or any questions or comments, email us at notsoneutralzone@yahoo.com, and we'll see you next week.